It stands immaculate, white columns glowing in the sunlight, a perfect lawn, a flag that never stops waving. To the world, it's the symbol of American freedom, the house where power lives. But if you look closer, the cracks start to show. Because before it was the White House, it was something else entirely. A construction site carved from swamp and sweat. A project born from compromise, ambition, and something far darker. 2 centuries ago, men who would never taste freedom built the home that came to represent it. They carved its stone, raised its walls, and vanished into history without names. The country called it progress, but for many, it was just another chain hidden behind marble and myth. What began as the dream of a young nation became its quiet contradiction, a mansion meant to embody liberty, built by those who had none. And the deeper you go into its history, the whiter the paint, the darker the truth. A promise whispered between men who thought they were inventing a new kind of world. No kings, no crowns, just a house that belonged to the people, or so they said. The air of the 1,790 seconds buzzed with vision and ego. Cities were rising, fortunes being made, and a young country was desperate to look older than it was. They wanted marble like Rome, order like Paris, pride like London. A nation barely born was already dressing itself in the architecture of eternity. To prove America could stand among empires, they decided to build one of its own. Not a palace, they insisted a house. But everyone knew what it really was. A monument to power disguised as humility. They called it the President's House. The rest of the world would one day call it the White House. And long before a single stone was laid, its foundations were already cracked with compromise, ambition, and denial. It started with a deal, not between nations, but between men chasing power. In 1790, the United States was still fragile, 13 states arguing over money, pride, and control. Alexander Hamilton wanted the federal government to take on the debts of the Revolution. The South wanted something else in return, a capital of their own, something to prove the new nation didn't belong only to northern bankers and merchants. The compromise changed history. Hamilton got his financial plan. Jefferson and Madison got a capital carved into southern soil. George Washington himself chose the site, a patch of wilderness along the Potomac River, humid, uneven, and crawling with mosquitoes. But Washington saw more than swampland. He saw a city that could rival London or Paris, grand avenues, monuments to liberty, and at its heart, a house for the president large enough to command respect, but not so grand it looked like a palace. The symbol of a republic that promised equality, dignity, and independence. On paper, it was perfect. But as surveyors mapped the land and laborers began clearing the fields, it became clear how costly perfection would be. The ground was soft, the weather is brutal, the money scarce, and yet the work began stone by stone, foundation by foundation. A house for the Republic's promise was about to rise, one that would demand more than anyone expected to build it. Before the first stone was ever set, the question was simple. What should the home of freedom look like? It couldn't be a palace. America had just escaped one king, it didn't need another. But it couldn't be small either. A young country needed something that looked eternal. So in 1792, a contest was announced. Architects from across the colonies sent in their visions for the president's house, sketches of domes, arches, pillars, and dreams of marble. Some imagined castles, others simple halls of brick. Hidden among the entries was one sent from an Irishman named James Hoban, a man who'd come to America chasing work, not glory. His design was graceful, balanced, and restrained European in influence, but humble in its dignity. The kind of house a republic could believe in. Washington loved it. The plan was chosen, and as Hoban's lines became foundations, a city of ideals began taking shape. But ideals don't lift stone. They don't dig trenches. They don't swing hammers in the summer heat. The men who did that part would never see their names etched in history. Yet without them, the White House, the symbol of liberty, would never have existed at all. The work began in silence. The 13th of October, 1792, the cornerstone was set. The crowd small, the speeches brief. The city around it was still a swamp, half-built streets dissolving into mud. But at the center of it all, the foundation of the president's house started to rise. Every day, the sound of chisels echoed across the Potomac. Stone from Virginia quarries arrived on barges, pale and heavy, carved by hand into perfect blocks. Masons leveled the walls. Carpenters framed the floors. From a distance, it looked like progress order emerging from wilderness. Up close, it looked like exhaustion. The heat was unbearable. Mosquitoes swarmed. Injuries were common. Some of the men could leave at the end of the day. Others could not. Official records called them laborers for hire. The pay went not to their hands, but to the men who owned them. They were rented, traded, and returned when the work was done. Their names, if written at all, appear only in faded ledgers beside numbers and initials. Yet their work remains in every block of stone still standing today. The nation would call the building a triumph. For the people who built it, it was just another burden carried in silence. At night, the men slept beside the stones they carved, their fingerprints still pressed into the mortar by morning. Hundreds of men labored through 12-hour days beneath a sky that burned. The Potomac reeked of rot. Mud swallowed their boots. Fever stalked the camps. Some earned a few coins for their sweat. Most earned nothing. In ledgers, they weren't listed as men at all. Just numbers beside the words Negro hire. Their names erased, their bodies rented, their labor sold to the same government that promised freedom for all. They carved the sandstone still standing today, their hands bleeding against the blocks that would hold up the nation's pride. They built fireplaces they would never warm themselves beside, staircases they would never climb. They carried the weight of liberty on their backs, literally. The president's house was supposed to represent democracy. Instead, it was built by those who had none. And when it was finally finished, when its walls gleamed in the sun, no one remembered them. They were gone, erased from history, before the paint was even dry. By 1800, the mansion stood tall against the muddy skyline, its sandstone walls glowing in the sun. To visitors, it was breathtaking, a palace for a republic that swore it hated palaces. Inside, chandeliers sparkled over unfinished floors. Crystal clinked against silver as white men toasted freedom inside a house built by people who had none. John Adams moved in first, complaining about the drafts, but proud of what it represented. His wife hung laundry in the East Room because the plaster was still wet. A few years later, Jefferson filled those same rooms with art, wine, and books about liberty, while the people who had built his walls remained enslaved a few miles away. Every dinner, every speech, every handshake beneath those chandeliers carried the same quiet hypocrisy, the celebration of liberty inside a monument to bondage. Outside, the Capitol was still half swamp. Inside, the Republic congratulated itself on progress. The walls were white now, freshly painted to hide the stains of smoke and labor, but no paint could cover what it was built on. The president's house had become the White House, a symbol of power and purity, resting on foundations poured by the enslaved. And the men who lived there called it destiny. August 24th, 1814. The sky above Washington glowed red. British troops marched through the city, their torches turning the Capitol into a furnace. Inside the president's house, the tables were still set for dinner crystal, china, and half-finished wine. The soldiers laughed, ate what they found, and then set everything on fire. Flames swallowed curtains, portraits, and the wooden bones of the house. The roof collapsed. Heat cracked the sandstone walls. Outside, the glow could be seen for miles, a nation's pride burning in silence. Some called it revenge for the war. Others called it humiliation. But for the few who remembered how the house was built, it felt like something else entirely. Justice. For 2 days, the fire raged, devouring the mansion built by enslaved hands. The white facade turned black, the air thick with the smell of ash and paint. When the smoke finally cleared, all that stood were the stone walls, the same stone carved by the men history refused to name. America had lost its symbol. But in the ruin, something raw and honest was revealed. The truth of what the White House really was. A monument to freedom, reduced to what it was always made of: other people's suffering. And still, when the ashes cooled, the first order wasn't to rebuild differently, it was to paint it white again. But instead of starting over, America rebuilt it exactly as before. The same architect, James Hoban, was called back to raise it from the ashes, and once again, enslaved men were forced to build the nation's greatest symbol of freedom. Some were the very same workers or their sons who had carved the first stones 20 years earlier. This time, their names appeared in payroll ledgers as Negro hire. The government paid their owners, not them. The fire had blackened the sandstone, so the walls were painted white to hide the smoke, to hide the history. Layer after layer, the burn marks disappeared beneath a color that promised purity. It wasn't restoration, it was denial. And as presidents spoke of liberty in its new halls, those same halls echoed with the silence of men who built a country that never meant to include them. The White House was reborn, brighter than ever. But the whiter it became, the darker the truth it buried. They called it rebirth. The press called it triumph. The people called it the White House. But beneath the marble and pride, something never stopped rotting. Every new president walked those same halls, greeted by chandeliers that once hung over men in chains. They spoke of liberty, democracy, the will of the people, while servants, many of them black, still moved silently through back corridors, unseen and uncredited. The myth grew. The people's house, a shining beacon of freedom. But whose people? The men who signed laws at those desks, or the ones who built the desks themselves? Even after slavery was abolished, the system that began with the White House kept evolving: new names, same control, freedom for some, servitude for others. And through every century, every war, every president, the building's perfection stayed untouched, its whiteness undisturbed. Tourists came to marvel at it, to take pictures, to feel proud. None of them saw the payroll ledgers, the blood under the paint, or the truth hiding in the walls. The White House became more than a mansion. It became America's reflection, flawless from afar, haunted up close. For 2 centuries, the White House has stood as the heart of the free world. But look closer, and it's more than a home. It's a confession carved in stone. Every column, every coat of paint, every whisper of the word white carries 2 meanings. To the world, it's the home of liberty. To history, it's the house that freedom forgot. It was never just a residence, it was an illusion. A place where the word freedom was polished and performed, while the foundation beneath it was built by the unfree. The longer it stood, the more that contradiction became invisible, buried under ceremony and pride. Presidents changed, flags changed, but the walls stayed the same, perfectly white, perfectly silent. The house became America itself, both noble and guilty, both beautiful and built on pain. Because the truth about the White House is that it doesn't just represent power, it represents what power chooses to forget. Today, the White House shines brighter than ever. Tourists line the gates, presidents wave from its balcony, news anchors call it sacred ground. But no one says what's buried beneath, not the ledgers with names replaced by numbers, not the bones of the men who never owned the freedom they built. 2 centuries later, the paint is still white, but so is the story. It was never just a mansion. It was America's first contradiction, dressed in marble and denial. The home of freedom, built on slavery. The symbol of equality, paid for in chains. They say it cost $5 million to build, but the real price was far higher. Because every stone, every pillar, every stroke of paint was bought with the same currency this country was founded on: silence.